Hello students, well in the last lecture we saw that the secession of 7 southern states was triggered by the election of President Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860. And when Lincoln took office in March of 1861, he tried to hold out the olive branch to the South. That is, he tried to present himself as a peacemaker in his first inaugural address. And in this speech, Lincoln said specifically that the North was not going to attack the South unless the South attacked first. Now, that was a pretty big promise. However, Lincoln also said that the federal government would have to defend any government property that was still held by the Union forces in the South. And what he was referring to were different military installations, bases, and Navy yards that were located along the coastline of the South. One of these forts in the South that was held by Union Army forces still, even after secession, was Fort Sumter, which was on an island off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, and had a garrison of Union troops under the command of Major Robert Anderson. And so Lincoln and his cabinet debated what to do about Fort Sumter. There were several options on the table, but finally Lincoln decided to do something very clever, and he notified Confederate President Jefferson Davis that he was sending some ships to Fort Sumter with no reinforcements, no additional troops, no weapons of any sort, only food and medical supplies were on the ships that Lincoln was sending to Fort Sumter. But that was not good enough for Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy, who were offended that the Union forces still held this territory that they claimed in the South. And so Davis ordered that Confederate forces in Charleston start to fire their cannons at Fort Sumter to try to get the fort to surrender, which it did on April the 14th, 1861. So the first fighting of the Civil War took place there at Fort Sumter near Charleston. And if you think about it for a moment, I think you'll see really how clever Lincoln's maneuver was. He was a very shrewd man, and essentially what he had done was to maneuver Davis into the position of being the aggressor, of firing the first shot in the war by sending those non-military supplies to Fort Sumter. That really made the Confederacy look like they had started the war, and so that was a big PR victory for Lincoln and the North at the very beginning of the Civil War, and it enabled Lincoln the following day to start calling up Union troops, 75,000 militia, what we would now call the National Guard, but just showing how optimistic he was at the beginning of the war. They were only summoned for a period of 90 days on the assumption that the rebellion would be crushed very quickly. Little did they know. Well, immediately when Lincoln started calling up troops, 4 more southern states seceded from the Union. North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and very importantly, Virginia, which had been the home of so many presidents and really was of great symbolic importance. But it's important to realize that there were actually 4 slave states that did not secede and that remained part of the United States throughout the Civil War. And those states were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. They're on the map in gold. So those states kept slavery in place throughout the Civil War. And in 1863, a 5th border state, as they were called, was created, federal troops had occupied the western part of the state of Virginia, which was originally much larger than it is today, as you see there on the map. And the people in western Virginia really didn't have that many slaves. It was a mountainous region. It wasn't good soil for plantations. And so they were actually quite happy to secede from Virginia and to rejoin the United States as the new state of West Virginia. That's how West Virginia was created during the Civil War, making it the fifth of the border states. Now, Lincoln was obsessed with keeping the border states in the Union. He really believed that if those states seceded, the United States could not win the Civil War. They were very strategic. They were well populated and quite wealthy at that time, and he thought that if the North lost those border states, that it would lose the war. And so he was really willing to do almost anything to bend over backwards to keep the border states part of the United States. And as we'll see, that drove a lot of his policy decisions in the early part of the war. For example, there was an incident when some troops from Massachusetts, the 6th Regiment from Massachusetts, were on their way to Washington, D.C. To help protect the capital. And in order to get there, they had to travel through Baltimore. And in Baltimore, they had to change trains, which involved getting out at one train station, walking across town, and getting on a different train to D.C. Well, while they were marching through Baltimore, a pro-slavery mob gathered and attacked the troops, and there was a huge riot in which several people were killed. And Lincoln's response to this incident was to round up all the members of the Maryland legislature whom he knew to be in favor of secession and simply throw them in jail without any kind of trial. Because Lincoln was absolutely determined to keep Maryland in the Union. And if you think about it, I'll go back here to the map for a second. The location of the District of Columbia, right there between Maryland and Virginia, made it imperative that Maryland stay in the Union, because if Maryland seceded, the capital, Washington, D.C., would have been completely surrounded by the Confederacy, and that would have caused huge problems for the North. So Lincoln was willing to use very strong arm tactics to keep Maryland in the Union. In Missouri, there was a lot of pro-secession sentiment. It was a slave state, obviously, and in St. Louis, pro-slavery citizens had gathered at a camp downtown called Camp Jackson, and they were drilling and preparing to take up arms in behalf of the South. Well, the Union commander in Missouri, Nathaniel Lyon, decided to put an end to that, and so he invaded the camp, destroyed it, and rounded up a number of people, threw them in jail, and killed some civilians in the process. But as a result, Missouri also stayed in the Union. And so really, Lincoln was willing to do just about anything to keep those border states in the Union. And he showed that even more dramatically on September 24th, 1862, when he issued his famous proclamation suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Now, what on earth does that mean? If you look at the Constitution, that document says that every American citizen has the right to habeas corpus. This is a term from English common law. Habeas corpus is Latin. It literally means you must show the body. In other words, if you're arrested for a crime, if the police arrest you for a crime, let's say accuse you of committing a murder, they have to show the body. They have to show that there is a dead body, and they have to have some evidence that links you to that dead body. and they have to put you on trial based on that evidence within a reasonable length of time. Otherwise, they have to let you go. They can't just hold you in jail indefinitely without a trial. That is the writ of habeas corpus. And it's one of our most cherished freedoms as Americans, and it's a protection against government tyranny. But in wartime, the president, according to the Constitution, or in a time of emergency, can suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and that is what Lincoln did. And by suspending the writ, Lincoln was empowered to round up anybody in the North who disagreed with the Northern War effort, and that resulted in the arrest of about 14,000 Northern civilians during the Civil War, mostly newspaper writers, but also some politicians who were in favor of making peace with the South. And Lincoln was able to throw them in jail and essentially throw away the key, or at least keep them there until he was convinced that they no longer posed a threat to the Northern War effort. And so, by doing this, Lincoln became a very controversial president. We think of Lincoln as a great hero, maybe the greatest American president of all time, but there were a lot of people, even in the North, who felt that Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant, an evil ruler. And you see that in this political cartoon on the left, which was from a Northern newspaper. And you see Lincoln depicted really as a monster or a demon of some sort. And he's stomping on one paper that says habeas corpus and another that says freedom of speech. And on his tail it says Abraham the Last. Kind of like the old King Andrew. You see that for Andrew Jackson, when people accused him of trying to be a king, you see Abe is wearing a crown there. But this cartoon is saying that he's not going to last long because he's a tyrant. And we'll talk a little bit more later about this issue of Lincoln being seen as a tyrant during the Civil War. Now, on paper, it really looked like this was going to be a very easy victory for the North. And if you look just at the material advantages that the North had over the South, really it's staggering. In terms of population, there were 22.3 million people living in the Union States. In the Confederate States of America, there were only 9.1 million people, but out of those, 3.5 million were African American slaves. And of course, the Confederate government was not going to give weapons to slaves and have them fight in the war because, of course, they would have simply used those weapons to free themselves or turn them against white Southerners, obviously. And so, until the very end of the war, when the South was really desperate, there was no attempt to arm the slaves. And so that took quite a few Southerners out of the war effort for the Confederacy. So huge advantage in terms of manpower for the North. And also the Industrial Revolution had advanced much more rapidly in the North than it had in the South. In 1860, there were two northern states, New York and Pennsylvania, each of which had more factories than the entire South put together. There were more factories in New York than there were in the entire South, more factories in Pennsylvania than in the entire Confederacy. And as a matter of fact, Confederate states only represented 7.5% of the total manufacturing output of the U.S. in 1860. And of course, that's a very important factor in wartime because armies need uniforms, they need wagons, they need saddles, and lots of food and supplies and things that are part of industrial output. And so really, this put the Confederacy at a big disadvantage. Also, believe it or not, even though the South was almost completely agricultural, the North actually grew more food than the South. And you may ask yourself, how is that possible? Well, if you think about the kind of crops that were being grown in the South, crops like tobacco, indigo, and especially cotton, you realize that those were things that could not be eaten. And so much of the southern farmland was devoted to those kinds of non-food crops, and so the North even had more of a food supply to feed their soldiers than the South did. Finally, that map on the right is a map of railroads, which are the lines in red, and you see very quickly that the North was covered with railroad lines, whereas they were pretty sparse in the South. In fact, the North had nearly 3 times more railroad mileage tracks laid than the South did when the Civil War began. And in this war, railroads would be a huge strategic factor because troops were frequently moved around from place to place on railroad lines. However, the South did have some advantages of their own heading into the conflict. One more practical advantage that they had was the existence of cotton. In fact, Southern cotton totaled about 60% of all U.S. exports to foreign countries in 1860. And so it was a big part of the gross national product, and taking that cotton out of the economy of the North really did hurt the North economically. And also, Southern cotton gave the South some leverage in their attempts to win allies overseas. And for a while, it actually looked like Britain and France might come into the war on the side of the Confederacy, because both of those countries were so dependent upon Southern cotton for their textiles. And so that was a very important plus for the South. But really, the South's advantages were more intangible. One advantage the South had relates to overall military goals. In order to win the war, the United States had to invade the South in several different places. They had to occupy the whole South and keep it under control, which required tremendous manpower to leave enough soldiers everywhere that they occupied to keep the inhabitants quiet. It was going to be a huge effort. Whereas the Confederacy, really, their goal was simply to stay alive. And they knew that if they could just stay in existence long enough, if they could just keep an army in the field long enough, that eventually the North was going to get tired of the war effort, and eventually they would agree to let the South go and make peace with the South. So the Southern strategy was really somewhat similar to Washington's strategy during the American Revolution. Just try to keep your army together and attacked long enough for the other side to give up. It was a much easier goal for the South. Furthermore, early in the war, the North was not fighting to end slavery. Lincoln said that over and over. We are not fighting to end slavery. We are fighting to save the Union. And that was a very noble goal, but it was also kind of abstract. You know, it didn't really hit home in the gut quite as quite as well as the Southerners' sense that they were fighting to defend their homeland and their way of life, slavery. And we've seen how nearly all white Southerners were very committed to the slave system, even the ones that didn't own slaves. It was part of their culture. It was an accepted part of their lifestyle. And people don't like other people telling them what to do, and that they have to change, even if what they're doing is wrong. And so when the North started to invade the South, Southerners were highly motivated to fight, to defend their homeland, their families, and so forth from what they saw as Northern aggression. And so that too was an advantage for the South. Finally, um, the South, from the very beginning of American history, really had had a great tradition of military heroism. And in fact, even today, if you look at the composition of our Army and Navy and Air Force and Marines, it's quite remarkable the percentage of our all-volunteer Army that actually comes from the South. It's way out of proportion to the number of people in the South. And throughout American history, many of the greatest generals like Washington and Jackson and Zachary Taylor and so forth had been from the South. And really, at the beginning of the Civil War, nearly all of the very talented generals in the U.S. Army, men like Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet, were Southerners. And when the war broke out, these men felt like they had to go with their home states, with their Southern homeland, and so quit the U.S. Army and joined the Confederate Army. And that left the Union Army at a real disadvantage because most of the military talent was on the Southern side, early in the war especially. All right, well, you know, at the beginning of wars, it's usually the case that both sides are very optimistic and believe that they're going to win the war very quickly. It's going to be over very soon. And that was certainly the case with this war. There was only one general on either side, really, who understood and realized that this was going to be a very long, bloody conflict, that it was not going to be ended overnight. And that was the head general of the U.S. forces at the beginning of the war, General Winfield Scott. Scott was a very old man. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, and he had to step down during the war because of old age. But at the beginning of the war, Scott looked at the situation and he said, look, this is going to be a war of attrition, you know. Essentially, instead of trying to win big smashing victories, what we should try to do is to since put the squeeze on the South and make it impossible for the South to survive. And so he came up with what he called his Anaconda Plan. Now, if you like to watch nature shows, you probably know that an anaconda is a gigantic snake that kills its prey by squeezing them to death. And that was Scott's idea. So essentially, you see there on the map, Scott proposed that the U.S. Navy surround and blockade the coastline of the South and essentially cut off the South from Europe and the rest of the world so that they couldn't get the supplies they needed to carry on the war. And he also recommended that capturing the Mississippi River become a main focus for the northern armies. And with that, then, the North would be able to surround the South on all sides by means of the Atlantic, the Gulf, and the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. Essentially, the North could squeeze the life out of the South and make it impossible for the South to continue the war effort. And Scott's plan was implemented to a large extent, although as it turned out, it would not be adequate in itself to bring about the victory. We'll talk about the other element of Northern strategy in just a moment. The South strategy, they knew that they were badly outnumbered, that they didn't have enough troops really to defeat the North, and that they were going to be on the defensive most of the time. But what they decided to do was to use the railroads to move troops around to wherever they were needed, to any place that was being attacked. And even though the South had fewer railroads than the North, they had enough railroads to make this work pretty well. So let's say the North invaded Mississippi. The Confederacy would put troops, say, from Virginia on trains and rush them to northern Mississippi, where the North was attacking, and hope to get them in there in time to stop the invasion. And this is called using interior lines on the railroads. And it actually it wasn't really a winning strategy, but it did manage to keep the South alive for much longer than anyone had anticipated. Back to the Union strategy. Supplementing the Anaconda Plan of General Winfield Scott was another strategic insight by General Ulysses S. Grant. Now, when the war started, Grant was a pretty low-ranking officer. He was stationed in Missouri under the command of General Henry Halleck. But from where he was stationed, Grant realized that the key to the war would be Georgia, actually. His ultimate goal was to invade Georgia. And the way he was going to get to Georgia was by striking down two rivers that run from the Ohio River down through Kentucky and into Tennessee. Those are the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River. You can see it better on this map. If you look at the southern tip of Illinois, you may be able to see the town of Paducah, Kentucky. And near Paducah, you see the Cumberland River is the river on the right, on the eastern side, and the Tennessee River is on the left. And both of those rivers flow down into Tennessee. And so Grant's strategy was simply to sail troops down those rivers to eliminate Confederate forts along the rivers, to take Nashville, which is on the Cumberland River, and from Nashville then to strike down into Georgia, march to the sea, and by doing that cut the Confederacy in half, making it impossible for the two halves of the Confederacy to coordinate the war effort. That was Grant's vision, and ultimately it was that vision that would win the war for the North. And Halleck gave Grant's plan a tentative approval early in the war, and so Grant launched his invasion down the Tennessee River and captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River on February 6, 1862. And then he marched his forces overland, what's now called Land Between the Lakes in Kentucky, to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, and he surrounded that fort. And the Confederate commander there, General P.G.T. Beauregard, realized that his position was hopeless, and so he sent Grant a message saying, "What terms will you give me if I surrender my men to you?" And this was part of warfare at that time. The generals would negotiate what terms troops would surrender, how they would be treated. When they surrendered, would they be allowed to keep their weapons? Would they be put in POW camps? You know, what was going to happen to them? Grant responded to Beauregard's message by saying, "I will accept no terms but unconditional surrender." And so from that moment he was known as Unconditional Surrender Grant, U.S. Grant. And that gave him a reputation as a very tough general to be reckoned with, because that was very unusual for a general to be that rigorous at that time. So Fort Donelson did surrender. Grant captured about 10,000 Confederate troops at Donelson, and then simply sailed down the Cumberland as he had predicted, and was able to capture Nashville, Tennessee, very easily. This was a great loss to the Confederacy, and the Union troops controlled Nashville for the rest of the war. But at that point, Grant's strategy got derailed or put on the back burner for a while, because, like I said, Grant was pretty low in the military chain of command at that point, and his superior, General Halleck, ordered him to move his troops not into Georgia but into Mississippi. And so Grant headed southwestward towards northern Mississippi, and on April the 6th he was camped at a place called Pittsburgh Landing in southwest Tennessee, near a church called Shiloh, which means peace. And that would turn out to be very ironic, because Shiloh became the scene of the first really bloody destructive battle of the Civil War, when Confederate troops under General Albert Sidney Johnston surprised Grant there and almost captured the Union Army there at Shiloh. And Grant, with great difficulty, after 2 days of fighting, managed to extricate his troops with the help of reinforcements that arrived from Nashville, and to get out of the trap that Johnston had set. But this was the first battle of the Civil War in which tens of thousands of men were killed and wounded, and really sent a signal that this war was going to be very long and very destructive. After Shiloh, Halleck then ordered Grant to take on the task of capturing Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was a fortress overlooking the Mississippi River, which essentially controlled the river. And so Grant was put to work on the Anaconda Plan, trying to capture the Mississippi River, and it took him more than a year to bring that about, and during that time he was prevented from carrying out his own plan. But as we'll see later, he was, later in the war, able to resume his goal of attacking Georgia. Well, in terms of overall strategy again, at this point in time, generals who went to West Point or other military schools were taught that the way to win wars was to attack. Attack, attack. It was a very aggressive mindset, and really this had to do with the great victories of the Emperor Napoleon in the late 18th, early 19th century, leading French troops to numerous smashing victories over their opponents by adopting this attacking strategy. What the generals didn't realize was that it was military technology that made Napoleonic tactics feasible, and that as technology changed, as weapons changed, the Napoleonic strategy of attacking at all costs became a liability rather than an asset. And the change I'm talking about has to do with the changeover from using muskets in battle to using rifled guns. Okay, and the difference between a musket and a rifle is that a musket has a smooth barrel inside, whereas a rifle has a groove carved into it. And with a rifle, what happens is that the bullet is guided out by the groove so that it comes out of the barrel of the weapon in a spiral pattern, almost like a quarterback in football throwing a spiral pass. It gives the rifle bullet greater accuracy and greater distance than the musket. A musket ball can only fly for up to 300 yards, no more than 300 yards, and really it's terribly inaccurate. There isn't really any point in even aiming a musket because you just don't know where the bullet is going to go. So the muskets that were used during the American Revolution and during the Napoleonic Wars, if you think about it, so let's say you're a defender and you're trying to hold off an attack with a musket. You can't even start shooting at your attackers until they're within 300 yards of you. So you get off one shot, then of course you have to reload. And while you're reloading, your enemy, the attacker, is right on top of you, and they've won, essentially. And so that really, it was the limited range of the musket that made the Napoleonic attacking strategy work so well. But in 1848, a Frenchman named Claude Minier invented a new kind of bullet, that the Minier ball, which you see there on the screen, that made it much faster to load rifles. Rifles had been around for a long time, but they were rarely used in battle because they took so long to load. But with the Minier ball, suddenly it was much faster loading a rifle than it had been before. And that enabled armies to start using rifles in battle. The Civil War was the first major war in which rifles, by the end of the war, both sides were entirely equipped with rifled weapons. And that had a huge impact. So now, let's say you're a defender. Let's say you're a defender in the Northern Army. Here comes Robert E. Lee attacking you. Well, you can start shooting when Lee is still half a mile away, and by the time his troops get within 250 yards of you, you can shoot with deadly accuracy and pick off the attackers one by one as they approach you. And so with the Minié ball, with the rifles, it became much, much easier for defenders to stop an infantry attack, an attack by foot soldiers. And so the advantage in the war really shifted to the defense. But the generals didn't realize that until the very end of the war. And so they kept trying to follow the strategy they had learned in military school. Attack, attack, attack. And over again during this war, you see generals attacking and losing huge numbers of men to these entrenched defenders using rifles. And that's why the Civil War was, and still is, the most destructive war in American history. Also, another thing I should mention about the Minié ball is that it tends to expand upon impact with the human body. Has an explosive effect, and so it created these terrible jagged wounds which you see here. These are skulls of soldiers from the Civil War who were killed in battle, and you see especially on the right there the effect of that almost explosive Minié ball expanding on impact and creating these huge jagged wounds which very few people would actually recover from, given the state of battlefield medicine at that time. But it took a while for people to realize what a destructive war this was going to be. And I just want to give a few highlights. I feel bad that I can't go through all the major battles of the war. You could have a whole course on the Civil War. In fact, I have taught an entire course on the Civil War before. So it's hard to compress it into one lecture. That's why this lecture is going to be so long. You might want to take a break and come back for the second half of the lecture at this point, perhaps. But there's just so much to talk about. The first major battle of the war took place at Bull Run, Virginia, or the Confederates called it Manassas after the train station that was nearby, but the Northerners called it the Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861. And the Northerners really thought this was going to be an easy victory. In fact, ordinary civilians from Washington turned out in droves and camped along the hills around Bull Run, bringing picnic baskets, hoping to have a pleasant little outing for the day because they thought it was going to be an easy Northern victory. But they really got their comeuppance. This turned out to be a bloodier battle than people had anticipated, and the Southerners put up a spirited resistance. It was during this battle that a General Thomas J. Jackson on the southern side was given his famous nickname. Another general pointed to Jackson and said, "Look, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall, fighting off the Union soldiers." And so from that point forward, he became known as General Stonewall Jackson until he was killed accidentally by his own troops later in the war. And thanks to the determined resistance of Jackson and the Confederate troops, at the end of the day, the Union soldiers had to retreat and really run back to Washington with their tail between their legs. What made the retreat worse was that all the picnickers who had come out to have, a nice day in the country, as they thought, got tangled up with the soldiers on the way back, and it really was a very confusing and chaotic scene. this retreat back from the First Battle of Bull Run. The battle was not as destructive as later battles in the war. Confederates took 2,000 casualties, that means 2,000 dead and wounded, only 1,600 for the United States. But it was a sign to the North that this was going to be a perhaps a much more difficult task than they had anticipated, defeating the South. At the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, Fredericksburg, Virginia, the United States Army commander was General Ambrose Burnside. It was Burnside's facial hair that gave rise to the term sideburns. His name was flipped for that, sideburns. Robert E. Lee was the Confederate commander, and he had gotten to Fredericksburg first. He had occupied a hill. And Burnside was determined to get Lee off that hill, to capture that hill. And so he decided to march his entire army up the hill to capture it from General Robert E. Lee. And, of course, as we learned talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill earlier in the course, really, as a soldier, you want to be on the high ground. It's much easier to defend and against an attack if you're on the high ground and you got a great line of fire down the hill. Soldiers are advancing up the hill with heavy packs, and Burnside found that out to his regret when in that one afternoon at Fredericksburg he lost 12,000 men attacking uphill against Robert E. Lee. It was in this battle that Lee uttered the famous remark, "It is well that war is so terrible, or we would grow too fond of it," because he was enjoying himself so much there at the Battle of Fredericksburg. But Lee got a taste of his own medicine at the famous Battle of Gettysburg, which really was a turning point in the war. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. Lee had decided to invade the North, to take the war to the North, in hopes of demoralizing the North and getting them to make peace with the South. And Gettysburg was as far north as the Southern armies ever got during the Civil War. Unfortunately, Federal troops got there first and occupied the high ground near Gettysburg first. And like Burnside, Lee felt it would be dishonorable for him to leave the Union troops in command of that high ground. Lee's Deputy General James Longstreet begged Lee simply to sidestep the Union Army, not to fight there at Gettysburg, not to fight on that bad ground. But Lee was determined. He felt it was a matter of honor. And so for 3 days, starting on July 1st, 1863, Lee tried to dislodge the Union troops from those hills surrounding Gettysburg. And finally, on the third day, he sent Colonel George Pickett of Virginia up a hill called Cemetery Ridge with a detachment of Virginia troops. And so they marched off with their flags flying and their drums beating and marched up that hill. And very calmly, the Northern troops on the top of the hill fired very accurately into Pickett's men and completely destroyed Pickett's division. 10,000 men gone. And it was, in a sense, the end of that heroic vision of warfare, Pickett's charge, on the last day of Gettysburg. And finally, Lee had to admit defeat and leave the North and return to the South. And from that point forward, the South would be on the defensive, and the end would be in sight. But, again, because of this change to using rifles and the shift of the advantage to the defenders, you have during the Civil War just terrible, terrible destruction that's piling up during the war. If you compare it to the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War lasted for 8 years, but during those entire 8 years, only 25,000 Americans were killed. whereas in the Civil War, military deaths totaled 633,000 men on both sides, making it the most destructive war we've ever engaged in. In fact, bloodier even than World War II for us. We lost more men in the Civil War than we did in World War II. Well, I said that the South had the greater military talent early in the war, and Lincoln had a very hard time finding a commander to suit him, a commander that would carry out his orders and be sufficiently aggressive. He was especially frustrated with General George McClellan, one of the early commanders. McClellan was famous for not wanting to fight, ever. And if the Confederate armies got near McClellan and his army of the Potomac, McClellan would send off panic telegrams back to Washington explaining why he couldn't fight, that he believed he was heavily outnumbered, even when he actually had more men. And so McClellan was actually very popular with the troops because he didn't like putting them in harm's way. But Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated with McClellan. After the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, the Union troops had Lee and the Confederates on the run, and Lincoln ordered McClellan to go after Lee, to pursue him and destroy or capture Lee's army. And McClellan kept coming up with excuses, and finally he told Lincoln that he couldn't move his army because his horses were tired and they had sore tongues from the bit that was in their mouths. And so Lincoln had had enough, and he fired back a telegram October 24th, 1862, where he said, quote, "I have just read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that would fatigue anything?" So finally, Lincoln got tired of the excuses. He fired McClellan, and he went through a whole series of generals trying to find the right one who could win the war for him. And finally, he settled on Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant finally achieved his goal of capturing Vicksburg, Mississippi, and he did it very symbolically on July 4th, 1863. On Independence Day and the day after the victory at Gettysburg. So this was a real turning point of the war. Controlling Vicksburg meant that the United States did control the Mississippi River. And in fact, they had partially split the Confederacy because this cut off Arkansas and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy because they were west of the Mississippi. So it was a huge victory. Lincoln wanted to give command of the whole army to Grant, but there was a problem. It was well known that Grant was an alcoholic. In fact, that was why his military career had been so lackluster before the Civil War. Grant was a drunk. Now, he managed to stay sober throughout most of the Civil War. He only went off on a few little sprees during the war. Was sober the rest of the time, but still people doubted the wisdom of putting young men's lives under the command of this of an alcoholic general. And in fact, a group of ministers came to Lincoln in the White House at one point and said, "How can you even think about appointing a man like this to be in command of our troops?" And Lincoln replied, "I can't spare this man. He fights." So Lincoln knew that Grant was determined to win the war as he was, and that he would carry on the war effort to the maximum. And so finally in March 1864, Lincoln decided to name Grant as the General-in-Chief of the Union Army. And in fact, even before that point, Grant's close friend, General William Tecumseh Sherman, had already launched the Georgia strategy that Grant had been pushing since the beginning of the war. Sherman invaded Georgia in September of 1863, only to meet with a very unexpected check at the Battle of Chickamauga in northwest Georgia, just across the border from Chattanooga, Tennessee, the Confederates won a very surprising victory at Chickamauga and pushed the Union troops back into Tennessee for the time being. However, the Federal troops rallied, and on November the 25th, were able to recapture Chattanooga, Tennessee, and from there, Sherman would be free to launch his decisive march to the sea through Georgia. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Let's digress here to another very important topic in the war effort: the role played by African Americans, especially by runaway slaves during the war. Now, when Union forces invaded different parts of the South, the slaves would get wind of that. As I said earlier in the course, the slaves had kind of a grapevine, they knew what was going on. News tended to spread from plantation to plantation, and when Union troops got near, they knew that was their opportunity for freedom. And so often the slaves would then seize the opportunity, run away, and try to get to the Union Army lines, hoping that they would be accepted there and would become free. And the Union generals really didn't know what to do with these men and women and children. General Benjamin Butler started calling them contrabands, and the name stuck. Contraband is something that's in a place where it's not supposed to be. And these runaway African Americans were not supposed to be behind the Union Army lines. Butler didn't know what to do with them, and so he and other generals wrote to Lincoln for advice. Oh, by the way, we call this voting with their feet, showing how much they hated slavery and the slave system by running away from their masters, who were often shocked because they really believed the propaganda that their slaves were happy and contented. They were in for a rude awakening when these contrabands began to run away. Well, Lincoln's response to the generals who wanted to know what to do with the contrabands is surprising, perhaps. He said, "I want you to send them all back to their masters. Send them back to the plantation." Now, that may seem crazy to us, but again, think about the border states. Again, this was the factor in the war that drove a lot of Lincoln's thinking early in the war. Lincoln knew that if he began encouraging slaves to run away and to seek freedom with the Union Army, that the border states would probably secede, because they still had slavery after all, and Lincoln felt that he could not be seen to encourage runaways escaping from slavery, because that might cause the border states to secede and might lose the war for the North. And so that was the reason for Lincoln's policy early in the war. But as the war went on, he started to get a lot of pushback from his generals on this issue, and the generals' attitude was basically, "What? Are you crazy? These people want to come and help us. They're willing to do anything, cook and do laundry and so forth, dig ditches, just because they want to be free. How can we turn them away?" And as more and more Northern soldiers were killed during the war, it became obvious that African American men could become an important source of manpower for the Northern Army as well as soldiers. And so Lincoln began to come around to the viewpoint that the contraband should be welcome, and they should be put to work for the Northern war effort. And that, in a way, was really the point of the famous Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln issued on January the 1st, 1863. And this document is frequently misunderstood. People sometimes think that it freed all the slaves. It didn't. It was the 13th Amendment passed later in 1865 that freed the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in those areas of the South that were still in rebellion, that is, still part of the Confederacy, that had not yet been invaded or controlled by the North. So, technically, on New Year's Day, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anybody, because everyone that was freed by the proclamation was still in the Confederacy. But what the proclamation did was to give the slaves even more of an incentive to run away, because now they knew that if the Union Army advanced through the South, and if they could get to the Union Army, then they really would be free, guaranteed. And so the pace of slaves running away only increased after the proclamation. And as it turned out, runaway slaves and free blacks made a huge contribution to the Northern War effort. And about 150,000, more than 150,000 African American men did serve in the United States Army during the Civil War, helping the North to win the war. But also, very important, the Emancipation Proclamation meant that for the first time now, the Northern War effort could be said to be about ending slavery, not just saving the Union. And as more and more Northern soldiers began to interact with these runaway slaves in the Union Army camps, and to hear their stories about what life was like under slavery, you can say there was a shift in attitudes among the soldiers and in many parts of the North, where people for the first time began to think that perhaps ending slavery was a noble goal, and so that became a centerpiece of the Northern War effort. I don't want to exaggerate that too much, but I do think that there was an increase in that sentiment, that the war became more about ending slavery after the proclamation. All right, well, back to Sherman's March. Sherman's March through Georgia is very controversial to this day, as sometimes you meet people in Georgia who are still mad about it. It really, though, is one of the key events in all of military history. Sherman's philosophy of war was something new. And it was best encapsulated after the war in a speech he gave, in which he said simply, "War is hell." War is hell. In other words, Sherman believed that war was bad. It was destructive. It was terrible, and that there was no way to put a good face on it. That you couldn't pretend to be a gentleman while you were fighting a war and be all chivalrous and courteous to your enemies. Because war was so evil, according to Sherman, the goal of war should be to put an end to it as quickly as possible, to put an end to the suffering and the destruction. And the way to do that was simply to win the war by any means necessary. And if that included terrorizing civilians, destroying their property, and so forth, well, so much the better. And so, really, the point of Sherman's march through Georgia was to demoralize the South by targeting, for the first time, actively targeting civilians, okay? Not massacring civilians. Civilians were not killed, by and large, unless they put up some resistance to Sherman's troops. But targeting civilians in the sense of burning their homes, stealing their property, setting free their slaves, of course, and essentially creating havoc throughout the state of Georgia. Sherman hoped that this would convince the average white Southerner that the war could not be won at this point, and would lead them to a greater willingness to possibly surrender. And it was very effective in this sense. Sherman reached the city of Savannah and near Christmas, and he famously presented it to Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas present in 1864, having achieved Grant's goal of splitting the Confederacy. But perhaps even more significant, the march through Georgia represents the invention of a new kind of warfare, what we call total war, in which civilians become a legitimate military target. And if you think about the great wars of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and so forth, you see that Sherman's belief that civilians should be a target of war was fully implemented. For example, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in 1945, that was an example of total war, massacring civilians who previously had been seen as not part of the war effort. The idea previously, before Sherman, had been that war was a matter for professional soldiers, and civilians should be left out of it. But Sherman essentially invented the concept of total war, and he did it right here in Georgia in 1864 with his Great March to the Sea, and really had huge consequences for all of humanity ever since. Meanwhile, while Sherman was marching through Georgia, Grant was mounting an offensive in Virginia, starting in May of 1864. And Grant's campaign involved a series of battles, one right after the other, in which the casualty counts were quite similar. If you look, for example, the Battle of the Wilderness, the U.S. took 18,000 casualties, the Confederates only 11,000. A few days later at Spotsylvania Courthouse, again the U.S. suffered 18,000 men dead or wounded, only 10,000 for the Confederates. Well, it looks like the Confederates are winning, doesn't it? But Grant was willing to take those heavy losses and to keep plowing forward. Why? Because simply he knew that the North could replace those men. The North had enough manpower to replace those casualties, whereas the South did not. General Lee and his army in Northern Virginia had no way of replacing those 10 or 11,000 men they were losing on a regular basis. And so you see that the war has become a war of attrition. That means that it was an effort to not to win great victories, but to wear down the South until the South simply could not go on. And so Grant was determined to make that happen and relentlessly pressed forward in spite of taking these terrible, terrible casualty totals. And some people in the North called Grant a butcher for that, but he believed it was the only way to win the war. Because of the progress Grant was making, and especially because of Sherman's great victories, the capture of Atlanta, and so forth, Lincoln was able to survive a huge challenge in the 1864 presidential election from General George McClellan, who ran as the Democratic candidate against Lincoln. And for a while it looked like McClellan might actually win. But thanks to Sherman's and Grant's victories, Lincoln was able to defeat McClellan, and that gave him the opportunity to give his second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865. This is a picture of Lincoln's second inaugural. If you look closely, scholars have analyzed this picture very carefully, and there up on the balcony, surrounded by the red circle standing over Lincoln below, is a man in a top hat who looks an awful lot like John Wilkes Booth, who, of course, within a few weeks would assassinate Lincoln. And probably this is Booth. We know from the records of the trial of Booth's co-conspirators that Booth was present at the second inaugural address and hoped to kill Lincoln on that day, but he couldn't get a good angle, and so had to postpone his plan. But this photograph is a chilling reminder of the fate that was about to overtake President Abraham Lincoln. Well, as Grant continued ruthlessly pressing forward in Virginia, finally he reached the Confederate capital, which had moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, and captured Richmond on April the 3rd, 1865. And Lincoln, of course, was ecstatic, and he immediately decided to come down and visit Richmond, and so he got on a boat and sailed down to Richmond on April the 4th and walked through the city, sat in Jefferson Davis's chair, and gloated a bit over the capture of Richmond. But there was a very poignant moment on that day as Lincoln was walking through the streets. This, of course, was the first day of freedom for the slaves in Richmond. They had been set free thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, and a group of newly ex-slaves approached Lincoln, threw themselves down at his feet, and began trying to kiss Lincoln's feet. Lincoln ordered them to get up, and he said to them, quote, "Don't kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only, and thank Him for the liberty you will hereafter enjoy." Very touching, I think. It shows Lincoln's humility at that moment in the war. 5 days later, General Lee had to surrender to General Grant at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, April the 9th, 1865. And for all practical intents and purposes, the Civil War was over. Although there were still some Confederate armies in the field, and there were some sporadic battles after Appomattox. Actually, interestingly enough, the very last battle of the Civil War took place at Columbus, Georgia, just down the road. And so there was some sporadic fighting after Appomattox, but essentially, with Lee's surrender, the war was over. But unfortunately for Lincoln, he wouldn't get to enjoy the victory for very long. And we have a story that was written down after the war by Lincoln's bodyguard, who was a close friend of Lincoln, named Ward Hill Lamon. Lamon claimed that on or around April 11th, 1865, Lincoln came down to breakfast with him and with Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and told them about a dream he had had the night before. And according to Lincoln, the dream went like this. "There seemed to be a death-like stillness about me. Then I heard subdued sobs, as if a number of people were weeping. I thought I left my bed and wandered downstairs. I kept on until I arrived at the East Room, which I entered. There I met with a sickening surprise. Before me was a catafalque," that was a platform that was used to put a coffin on which rested a corpse wrapped in funeral vestments. Around it were stationed soldiers who were acting as guards, and there was a throng of people, some gazing mournfully upon the corpse, others weeping pitifully. "Who is dead in the White House?" I demanded of one of the soldiers. "The President," was his answer. "He was killed by an assassin." Well, we only have this story from Lamon, and so we don't have any confirmation of this, but Lamon did know Lincoln very well, and so it's possible that Lincoln had a premonition of his own death, which took place a few days later on April 14th, 1865, which happened to be Good Friday that year, the day that Christians commemorate the crucifixion of Christ. Lincoln's wife, Mary, urged him to go to the theater, to Ford's Theater, where a comedy was playing called Our American Cousin. It was supposed to be a very funny show, and Mary really wanted to see it. And so, reluctantly, Lincoln agreed. His wife talked him into going to Ford's Theater, something that she would regret for the rest of her life, because as they were sitting in the presidential box at Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth entered the box and shot Lincoln at point-blank range in the back of the head. Now, you may ask, how was Booth able to get into the presidential box? Well, presidential security in those days was not nearly as tight as it is today. There was a bodyguard in the hall outside the box, but he really didn't notice Booth because Booth's job was he was a very famous professional actor. He was a Shakespearean actor, quite well known, and it was normal for Booth to be walking around behind the scenes at Ford's Theater, so nobody really took any notice of Booth and he was able to get into the box and kill Lincoln. But with his dramatic flair, after shooting Lincoln, Booth jumped off the balcony onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process. But as he jumped, he shouted these words, "Sic semper tyrannis." Now that was the motto of the state of Virginia at that time. It's Latin and it means, "Thus always to tyrants." In other words, Booth was saying that Lincoln was a tyrant and therefore he deserved death. And here again we have this perception of Lincoln as a tyrant. Now obviously Booth, as a Southern sympathizer, would have been especially inclined to see Lincoln as a tyrant. By the way, Booth's action was only part of a broader conspiracy. The goal was really to take out almost the whole cabinet, and so Booth's co-conspirators, one of them was supposed to kill the Vice President Andrew Johnson, but he chickened out. Another one actually did attack the Secretary of State, William Seward. Didn't kill him, but did hurt him quite a bit. But in any case, Booth was able to get his leg set, and then he got on a horse and rode into Virginia. But he was surrounded in a barn in Virginia by soldiers who set the barn on fire and then shot Booth. So he died there in Virginia. 4 of the other conspirators were put on trial, including a woman named Mary Surratt, and she and the other 3 were hanged. There's a very good movie about this called The Conspirator. I would recommend it, about Mary Surratt. But in any case, there were also Northerners, as we've seen, who believed that Lincoln was a tyrant. And there were reasons for that. It seems strange to us, but there were reasons for it, because it was really during the Civil War that the federal government began to take on the growth that would become characteristic later in the 20th century, where the federal government grew bigger and bigger, and more controlling, more involved in people's lives, more centralized. So some examples of that. Well, we've already seen that Lincoln, by executive order, set free at least some slaves, that is, without the permission of Congress, by his own decree, and nowadays more and more presidents govern through executive orders like that. Also, Lincoln instituted the first large-scale military draft in American history during the Civil War. Very large advance in governmental power, forcing people to fight in the war, that is, if they didn't have enough money to buy their way out of it. Also, the Lincoln administration essentially invented the modern paper dollar, which were called greenbacks in those days. Before the Civil War, money was essentially gold and silver coins, and paper money. Paper money did exist, but it wasn't until Lincoln that the federal government began to put out paper money. And that also represented a big increase in the government's role in the economy. As did the income tax. For the first time, the federal government imposed an income tax as an emergency war measure. Now, this was unconstitutional, really. And in fact, it would take a constitutional amendment later to make it legal during peacetime. But Lincoln put it in place during the war. The Transcontinental Railroad. This was one of Lincoln's brainchildren, you could say, and it was during the Civil War that the law was passed which made it possible for a railroad to be built from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which was a great symbol of national unity, and that was really Lincoln's goal during the war, to create out of the struggle, out of the conflict, a much stronger, more unified nation. That would no longer be simply a collection of states, but the whole nation would be greater than the sum of the parts. And that was something new in American history. Previously, the states had had more power than the federal government. And so, in all of these ways, Lincoln set a new course for the presidency for the national government, and that led some people to call him a tyrant.